Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining today. We'll give it one more minute and then we'll get started. All right, so thank you all for joining today. Welcome to the presentation. This is Mastering Your Qualitative Methodology. Sierra, it looks like that link went to hosts and panelists if you want to just share it in the chat to everybody. So just before we get started with the presentation, I'd like to share some information with you all. Oh, where did it go? So here at Statistics Solutions, we provide full dissertation editing services and support. So if you're interested to learn more, there will be some links in the chat to help you and direct you to the services that we provide. Just to give you an overview of what we'll be talking about today, this webinar is going to be focusing on the qualitative methods. So we'll be focusing just on the qualitative pieces. We won't be talking about quantitative today, but we do have resources on quantitative methods. If you're interested in them, they are available at our website. So today I'll be going over some sections of the dissertation that we commonly see in the methods chapter. So we'll be talking about the introduction, research design, including the rationale for the research design, role of the researcher, methodology, issues of trustworthiness, and then the summary. These are some typical sections that you'll find in the methods chapter, but I always recommend that if you have a template or if your school provides past examples of dissertations or any resources that you can get from your chair, it's always really good to make sure you look at that or any checklist that they provide to ensure that you're including the exact sections that they're expecting to see in your dissertation. If you don't have a starting point or any reference points like that, this presentation will be a good place to start, as these are some pretty common sections that you'll want to include. And then just to introduce myself, my name is Vanessa. I'm a qualitative mentor here at Statistics Solutions. So if you have questions, please feel free to pop them in the chat or to reach out to us using the links that Sierra has provided in the chat. Okay, so just to get us started, the purpose of methodology chapter is really to just describe the how to the reader. So the chapters preceding this one will be the why. That's where you're going to be talking about your literature and the gap in the literature and the reasons that your study needs to be conducted. But once you get here to the methodology chapter, we will be talking about how you plan on collecting the data and then also how you plan on analyzing it. So this section should be detailed enough that someone should be able to read it and then go on and reproduce your project. So you're basically creating somewhat of an instruction manual for how to create your study by listing the different steps that you took so that somebody else can take the same. So like most chapters, this chapter will begin with a short introduction where you will orient your reader to the purpose of the study and your research questions. One thing to note here is that when you're restating your research questions or your hypotheses, you'll want to make sure that they are restated verbatim, so exactly the same way as they appear in the other chapters of your dissertation. You want to make sure that the wording doesn't change and you're maintaining consistency. And that's just because words have meaning. So if you change the wording, it may change the implications for what that means for your research questions or the purpose. So you really just want to make sure you're being consistent. It may feel redundant. You may feel like you're copying and pasting throughout the document, but that's totally okay. In this case, you don't want to do that in some other instances, but when it comes to the purpose and your research questions or your hypotheses, you just want to make sure they're always the same. So once you do that, you reorient your reader. You can then list out the different section headings to give your reader a preview of what's going to be coming up in the chapter. Okay, so then we'll get to the research design. So one of the first things that you'll talk about in the methods justification is this research design that you plan on using for your study. So here you'll want to talk about the general research method as well as the design. So in this case, the general research method will be qualitative because we are in the qualitative session. So you'll want to talk about why you selected a qualitative design over a quantitative design. And you can do that by providing citations and rationale for the different elements of a qualitative design versus a quantitative design, and then align them to your purpose, problem statement, and also your research questions. So just showing why this is the best design for the study that you're conducting. Then you will want to talk about the different qualitative research designs within the framework, and you'll want to talk about the one that you've selected, but also demonstrate your knowledge of general qualitative research designs to show that you've considered other designs and you have decided that they don't work. So that could look like defining what a case study is and then detailing why a phenomenological study doesn't work for your particular research design. So you're showing that familiarity by saying, I know what this study is, and because this study does X, Y, Z, it doesn't align with my particular goals for this dissertation. Okay, and then so why in that case would you use a qualitative design? So when you're making those distinctions between qualitative and quantitative, these are the features that you want to think about. So oftentimes in a qualitative design, the research question might be along the lines of trying to understand participants' perspectives or something like their experiences or their lived experiences and how they make meanings of those experiences. So to really get at this, you would need to collect data through interviews, focus groups, maybe some document analysis or even observations. So really drawing that distinction, it's a lot easier to get at those more complex questions of lived experiences or how people make sense of their experiences when you're utilizing these types of data sources as opposed to maybe a survey, which is going to give you very discrete answers, but isn't going to really develop those rich responses that a qualitative interview might. So that is one reason why you might choose to use a qualitative design. They're just yielding that textual data that's going to really answer those questions in a deep way. So the goal in qualitative studies, unlike quantitative, although it's up for debate, is not necessarily going to be to generalize the findings. So when we talk about quantitative methods, we're always talking about, is this sample representative of the population? You know, can I generalize these findings to other groups? In this case, when you're looking at a qualitative study, generally your sample size is going to be much smaller. You might have maybe 15 to 20 people that you're interviewing, depending on your research design or on the design that you've selected. So in this case, the goal is not necessarily to generalize the findings, but rather to really get an in-depth look at a particular phenomenon or to get an in-depth description of a particular case. So that is another reason why you might choose a qualitative study, or if you know that you plan on using an interview and you plan on using a smaller sample size, that's some rationale for why the qualitative would align best. And then some other things to note: if you are using a qualitative study, they differ from the quantitative in that you won't be doing any hypothesis testing. So you won't be developing a hypothesis in the qualitative research, and you won't be quantifying the results at all. So we won't really be providing like statistical inferences for this data. Instead, you'll be describing what themes emerged. So that's just another reason why you might choose a qualitative design over quantitative. But ultimately, your research questions are going to be the driving factor. So if you've got questions that are relating to these more abstract concepts like lived experiences, then the qualitative is the best method for you. But if you're looking to see, to quantify relationships or to understand if something is statistically better than something else, then you may want to go the quantitative route. So there are a number of qualitative designs that you can use for your study. This is not an exhaustive list. These are just some that I've commonly seen with students. So I'll give a high-level overview of each of these to give you an idea of what they're used for. But here are a few. So we've got case study, phenomenology, a generic qualitative design, grounded theory, and then ethnography. Again, not an exhaustive list, but these can be helpful, and they may align with research questions that you have in mind. So case studies are really helpful when you're looking at a specific example of something, perhaps over time. It is an in-depth analysis of a particular case or group of cases. So I like to think of this as just taking a really deep dive into something and looking at it from 360 degrees. So getting a really holistic look. Multiple case studies are if there's something that bounds each of the cases. So maybe if you're looking at teachers within a Philadelphia school district, the bounding feature there would be that they all work within a Philadelphia school district. So that's just an example of if you're doing a multiple case study. In a case study type of design, you probably wouldn't be only collecting data from one data source. So you probably wouldn't just do an interview or just do a focus group. The hallmark of this design is that you would be incorporating multiple forms of data collection. So that can be something like using document reviews, using observations, something like that. So incorporating different things. If you're doing a mixed method study, you can potentially include quantitative data to supplement the qualitative data that you're collecting. And that also would suffice for those multiple data collection methods. And again, just thinking back to the purpose of a case study, the reason that you're going to be using those multiple data collection methods is because the purpose here is that you're really drilling down into that case and looking at it from all angles. So you want different types of data to inform what you're learning about that particular case. And then the outcome here is generally a really rich description of that case. And you can use something like thematic analysis in your analysis plan to determine the themes or the patterns that emerge from the study of the case or cases that you've included. The next study I'm going to go over is phenomenology. So this is a bit different. It has philosophical underpinnings. It's also deeply rooted in psychology because it has to do with those lived experiences and really making meaning of them. So if you're exploring how people make sense of their lived experiences, or something like that, then it's probably your research questions or your study probably aligns with this type of design. And even within phenomenology, there are different types of designs. So again, high level overview here, but be aware that there are different approaches. So if you're choosing to go with this, you'll want to dig deep into the literature to see which type of phenomenological study or design works best for you. But generally, these make use of in-depth interviews. So kind of different from case studies, where in case study, we're looking at multiple data sources. Here, we're going to just be looking at interviews or focus groups. So you can really focus on one data collection method for this type of design. And when I say in-depth interviews, I mean, you might be spending hours with participants. You might be conducting multiple interviews with them over time. So really just, again, getting into that interview protocol and really trying to understand the lived experience that a participant is describing. And then the outcome here is that you'll be distilling the experience down to what we call its essence. So really getting to the core of that experience and understanding how people are making sense of it and how they are assigning meaning to it. Next, I'll talk about the generic qualitative design. So this is helpful if your study doesn't fit squarely within any other framework. So again, with this design, sometimes it's overlooked because it's generic. People kind of don't understand what that means, or they might assign less worth to it because it doesn't sound as fancy as, phenomenology or, some of these other designs that may be more written about. But this is a really good design if you're less concerned with how people make sense of an experience and more concerned with the experience itself. So this focuses more on the outward and not that inward experience. So you can use this, you can use interviews in this case, questionnaires, surveys, written or oral documents. So you've got a large range of flexibility as far as the data collection technique that you'll use for a generic study. And then I did pop a citation here on this slide for Percy 2015. If you are wanting to use this type of design, that paper does a really good job of explaining why this type of design is sufficient done on its own. So making the case for why you don't need a more involved type of design, but you can really work within the flexibility of the generic qualitative. So if you plan to use this, I recommend that paper in really just giving that defensible rationale for why you would need it. Next, grounded theory. This is something I don't see too often. It's very sociological in nature and used in the social sciences. So this works a little bit differently from the others in that you wouldn't be working from a theoretical framework and you wouldn't necessarily be working from research questions. So here the idea is that there's not a lot known about a particular topic. And so through the data collection, and this could also be through something like field work, interviewing, taking memos, maybe some participant observations, you would learn about the topic and refine your ideas and your research questions based on that. So rather than developing your research questions first and then collecting data, you're collecting data and letting that guide you to the research questions. So this is an iterative process and it kind of starts in a different place. So it's not always best used for novice researchers. It's also both time consuming. And then of course, within the constraints of a PhD program, that can be also financially consuming, depending on how long this type of study takes to conduct. So that's one thing to consider if you're thinking about grounded theory. It's that it might be a little bit more time intensive than the other studies. And then the outcome for this type of study is that you will develop a theory that's rooted in your data. So here you'll think about an explanation of whatever's going on, whatever that concept is. You'll kind of develop thoughts around the process, actions, or interactions to develop the theory for what you're seeing in the data, as opposed to the other studies where you're taking your theory and allowing it to guide the data collection and analysis. This just goes in the other direction. And then ethnography, this is another one that I don't see too much of. This is really an anthropological design in nature. It also has roots in sociology. So here you'll be making use of extended time in the field, and participant observations. So again, in terms of resources, it can be a little bit more time consuming. And of course, that has implications for how long it takes to complete the dissertation, but it can be really helpful if you're trying to understand the cultural or societal context of a problem. So this is holistic in nature, similar to the others. Here you'll be looking at networks of people or institutions or groups of people to understand all of the circumstances surrounding surrounding whatever your research problem is. So the outcome here is that you'll develop an in-depth account of whatever the problem is from the perspective of the participants, but also from the perspective of yourself, so as the researcher. So you're getting this kind of insider and outsider perspective within the larger cultural context of your research problem. So in this case, the process is called ethnography, and then the outcome, so the written product, is also called ethnography. So those are just a few research designs that I've seen people use. Next, I'm going to talk about a different section, so the role of the researcher. So as the researcher, you'll have different roles, and in this section, you'll just want to describe what those are. So if you're conducting grounded theory or an ethnographic study, your role will probably be as a participant observer, where you're both observing people as well as participating in activities in daily life with the group that you're observing, since those are more integrated studies where you're kind of looking at it both as a participant and as a researcher. But that isn't the case for all studies. So you may be in a situation where you are simply collecting and analyzing the data. In that case, your role is more less of a participant and more as a researcher, right? So here you'll just want to describe that. If you are lucky enough to have research assistants that are maybe collecting or interviewing the participants for you, you'll want to talk about that here too. And the overall goal is to give the reader an idea of the impact that your data collection method has and how that relates to your study. So they want to understand how you yourself are engaging in the research. And the reason for that is because as the researcher, you will bring certain biases into your study. And so by really describing the ways in which you're going to be engaging with the research, whether that's consenting participants, interviewing them, collecting data, analyzing the data, we just want to understand where those biases might come into play and what the implications of that might be. And as the researcher, your research problem probably has some importance to you. It may be something that you're passionate about. So it's not uncommon to have blind spots when it comes to passions. So here's where you really want to talk about how you intend to mitigate any influence that you have over your research and the outcomes of it. So that transparency is sort of what we're aiming for here in this section. Also, if there are any power differentials between you and your participants, this would be a place to talk about those as well. So if you're a teacher and you're interviewing students, that is definitely something that you want to talk about. How are you ensuring that students are able to really speak openly and just kind of describe that power differential and what it means for your study? And then really here, you also want to emphasize how you plan on just reducing any biases and being transparent to mitigate any potential conflicts that could arise in your study. Another one here I want to mention too, if you work at the place where you're going to be collecting data, that's another common ethical issue that you just want to think about, what are you going to be doing to mitigate any potential difficulties with that? The next section will be the participant section. So here you'll want to talk about the overall population from which your sample will be drawn. Important here to recognize the difference between population and sample. So reminder that the population is the larger group. So if you're wanting to study maybe kindergarten teachers in your local school district, the larger population could be kindergarten teachers, and then the sample is going to be the actual people that are included in your study. So you'll want to describe that target population. You can do that by providing an estimate for how many people are in that population. So how many kindergarten teachers are in the school district that you're going to be studying. And you can also provide some statistical information about that group. So you can give a demographic breakdown, talk about maybe the highest level of education, the ethnicity, race, age, things like that. Just thinking through what statistics the reader might want to know about that population that's going to help them make sense of your results later on. Then you'll want to do the same for the sample. So describe the sample that you intend to use and also provide an idea of how many people you intend to include in your sample. Now, when you do that, you can pull in literature based on your research design. There's a lot of literature to give rationale for why a particular sample size is better than another. So in this section, I do recommend pulling in some citations to justify the methods that you intend to use. Next, you'll want to talk about your sampling strategy. So since this is a qualitative study, you're probably not going to be using random sampling. You'll probably be using some kind of purposeful sample. And that's just because there's a good chance that you're looking for a particular participant. So again, whatever your research question is, probably not anybody can fit into it, right? There's probably some criteria. So maybe you're trying to understand the perceptions of women in the postpartum period. So in that case, you're looking for those specific women who have recently given birth. So that's why your study is probably going to align more with a purposeful sample, just looking for those people that fit. So you'll want to describe that here. And again, pull in citations to explain why you're doing that. You'll also want to establish the inclusion criteria for the study. So thinking through what are the characteristics that people must meet to participate in your study. So that could be certain age limits. You're looking for people who are 18 and over. It could be that you're looking for people who work at a particular location. So whatever that is for you, you'll just want to describe that here. And then you'll want to talk about how you plan on verifying that inclusion criteria. So are you going to phone screen participants prior to interviewing them? Are you going to send out a survey that confirms that they do meet the criteria? Whatever that process looks like for you, you'll just want to outline it here. And then again, getting back to the number of participants, in addition to giving an estimate and providing citations for why you believe that sample size estimate is appropriate, you'll also want to talk about what you intend to do if you're not able to accomplish that sample size. So what plan do you have in place? Let's say a good example is if you planned on recruiting in person, 15 participants, and then the pandemic hit and you're not able to recruit in person anymore. What steps might you take to still achieve that sample size? And then you also want to relate this back to data saturation, since this is a qualitative study, thinking about how many participants do you think you'll need to reach data saturation, again, using references as your reasoning. And then let's say, for example, you don't reach data saturation. So maybe you interview 15 participants and on the 15th participant, a new theme emerges. And you maybe want to go in and then interview maybe 3 or 4 more participants to see if there's any more themes that emerge within the data. So just thinking through how you plan on tapping into that sample. Okay, and then next will be your instrumentation section. So here you'll want to include information about all of the data collection instruments. So if you're conducting a study that is using an interview protocol, you'll want to describe that protocol here, and also how you went about developing that protocol. If you're using a study that requires multiple data collection methods, so for example, if you're using a case study, you'll also just want to describe that here. So anything that you plan to use to collect data, you'll just want to outline it here. And I recommend using subheadings to make it very clear for the reader, not really mixing within the paragraph. I find that that's a pretty effective method to get this information out clearly. If you're using any instruments that have already been published, that's perfectly fine, as long as you have permission to do that, of course. And then if you do that, you'll want to state that in the section and talk about when it has been used in the past, what it has been used for, and kind of connect the dots for why it's appropriate for your study. And then if you're conducting any kind of document review or analysis, you'll want to identify what sources you plan on reviewing and then how you plan to verify their accuracy. So basically here you want to demonstrate that the data sources are going to be sufficient to address your research question. I think here it's also helpful if you do plan on using multiple data collection methods to set up a table in this section where you can just clearly align the data collection technique and the instrument that's being used to the research question in your study. So kind of providing that clear table depiction, but also creating a narrative for the reader so that they're not kind of just happening upon a table in your paper. Okay, and then next you will go through your recruitment procedures and then your data collection. So again, this should all be in a very step-by-step fashion. So you'll want to go through kind of almost in list form, but of course keeping it in that narrative. Here you'll want to talk about the instruments that you are using with regards to the data collection. Oh, I see we have a question in the chat. Okay, so I see we have a question in the chat about software to do the chart. I just use tables in Microsoft Word, and I find that to be pretty effective. You can just insert a table and just tailor the columns and the rows to have headings for whatever it is that you're writing. I find that to be very effective and pretty easy. But getting back to the methodology here. So here you want to talk about how you plan on collecting the data. So again, being really detailed. How are you going to collect it? Who are you collecting it from? What's the frequency that you plan on collecting it, if you plan on doing it maybe over time? And then any plans for how you are going to record the data. So what that might look like in the real world is I plan on interviewing 15 teachers in the school district. I'm going to interview them at one time point for 60 minutes. And to record the data, I'm going to have the teachers connect on Zoom. We will use Zoom recording, and then the data will be transcribed for analysis. So that's kind of a very like quick and simple plan, but those are all the details that you want to include. And then you'll also want to include any contingency plans in case participants maybe don't show up for their interview or focus group. You know, what are you going to do? Will you be connecting with them again? Will you be pulling in other people from your participant pool? And then also any plans for if you lose data. So maybe you forgot to hit record, or, you know, what are the plans to ensure that you're getting all of that data collected very clearly? So here you'll want to outline that. And then if you intend on doing any type of debriefing procedures with participants or any follow-up, so one example of that could be like member checking, or another could be transcript verification. If you plan on having participants look over the data you've collected before you go on to analyze it, you just want to describe that as well in this section. And I'll talk a little bit more about member checking later in this presentation. All right, so then now you've talked about why your study's needed, what your study's about, what type of design you're going to use, and then how you're going to collect your data. So one of the last steps here is going to be the data analysis plan. So here, this is going to be informed by the type of study that you're conducting as well. But here you'll just want to talk about the type of analysis that you're doing, and you'll want to go through each research question. So if you plan on analyzing the research questions with different analyses plans, then you'll want to talk about that. One example of analysis that I see very common is thematic analysis. If you're doing something with interviews or observational or document data. So you'll just want to outline what that looks like. You'll also want to talk about how the data are connected to the research questions and then any coding procedures that you plan on using for it. So typically in qualitative studies, you'll use some type of software to help organize the data. A few that I've used and I would recommend are NVivo, Deduce is good, MaxQDA. They just help you organize all of your transcripts in one place, and you're able to kind of code line by line if that's appropriate for your study. So you would read each sentence of the transcript, you would code specific excerpts for things that emerge. So for example, if you're reading and you notice that a lot of teachers are talking about a specific problem that they're having with curriculum, you would code that. And then once you've coded all of your transcripts, you'll look to see if the codes fit into categories, and then through that, develop your themes. So it can be helpful to use a software because it can help you look across all participants and see all excerpts that fall under one particular code or category. But other methods that I've seen used are things like creating interview summaries or using Excel to chart the different topics that emerge. But those are just some things to consider. So what program are you actually going to be using to analyze the data? And then you'll also want to think about any discrepant cases and how you plan on handling that. So although you're expecting to see commonalities between your participants, it's uncommon for every single participant to describe the same experience. So if you have any cases where they are outliers, or maybe they're describing something that's in complete opposition to the other participants, that's still important data. So we don't want to omit it. We do want to make sure to talk about it. So here you'll just want to talk about how you intend on identifying those cases and then how you intend on reporting back on them. And then the next section relates to trustworthiness. So there's a lot of literature on trustworthiness in qualitative data. The 4 tenets that you typically want to talk about are credibility, transferability, dependability, and then confirmability. And these all have to do with, are you confident that your findings are accurate? Or that they're applicable in other contexts or groups of participants. So there's different ways that you can establish this. So earlier I talked about member checking. One way that you can kind of get at this trustworthiness is you can have participants review a transcript, the transcript, or review the analysis that you have done and ask them if they feel that it accurately portrays what they've described. So that's just one method you can use. Another method could be triangulating your data. One misconception with triangulating data is that you need 3 data sources, but that's not the case. 2 data sources are just fine. So if you are conducting maybe a focus group and then also conducting interviews, you can look across both and say, okay, does what I found in my focus group confirm what was in the interview? And that's just another step to kind of verify that, the topics that you're coming up with, there's some general consensus around those. Other options, you can do maybe an audit trail where you're sort of journaling your steps as the researcher and really clearly throughout the data collection and analysis process, just talking about your thoughts and the reasons for why you did things. So why did you code something in a specific way, or why did you develop a particular theme? That can be another helpful method. What I'd like to do in this section is have a subheading for each of these 4 tenets. And then what I recommend is that you go through and talk about how you plan to establish each of them in your own study. And then going along with that, you will also want to describe the ethical procedures in its own section for your study. This is also very helpful as you're moving into IRB. So you'll want to talk about the information in this section of, how are you ensuring that you are respecting the participants? How are you ensuring that you're going to be keeping their information confidential or anonymous? So here you'll want to outline the procedures that you're going to be taking. So if you are collecting data, maybe using video conferencing like Zoom, how are you going to ensure that all of those files are safe and secure and not, maybe on an open network or shared widely throughout your research team? So here you'll want to think about what that looks like for you. So it could be that you have a password protected folder where you are keeping data. It could be that you're de-identifying data, so you're not including participant names, but you're just identifying participants by numbers. Whatever that looks like for you, you'll want to describe that here. You'll also want to outline any permissions that you've obtained. So if you're collecting data at a particular organization, for example, maybe a homeless shelter or a hospital, you'll want to outline any approvals that you've received from those organizations to collect data there in this section as well. And then one thing to consider as well, if you are saving data, you want to make sure that there's a plan for what you're going to do when you have completed your study. So typically you'll destroy the data. You'll want to outline that here. At what time or at what point will you be getting rid of the data that you've collected? Particularly if you plan on following up with participants, it's good to outline what that looks like. How long after the initial data collection point will you be keeping the data for? And then the last section of this chapter will be the summary. I see some people kind of phone it in here because it does seem kind of like a throwaway section, but you really want to think about, if your reviewer reads none of your chapter and only reads your summary, what do they need to take with them into the next chapter? So really just summarizing those main points, but still digging deep here. It shouldn't be too short. You really want to make sure they are getting all of the elements from each of the sections that we've just described. So they know what type of participants you're recruiting. They know how you plan on collecting the data, analyzing it, and how you plan on maintaining both your ethics and the trustworthiness of your data. And then once you've summarized all of that, you want to transition into the next chapter. So you are kind of looking back at this chapter and then looking forward by telling them what's coming up. So you might say something like, in the next chapter, I will present the results, something like that, letting them know what subheadings to expect to come. And then I just have some overall tips for thinking about approaching this chapter. So what I've seen is that a lot of people will stumble here with writing block. So your introduction generally goes pretty smoothly. Your literature review might as well. But once you get to chapter 3, it's kind of like, okay, what am I doing, right? You've got all of these ideas for the type of data you want to collect, but now you really need to get down and give the actual plan for it. So here it's important to remember that you're not going to be summarizing and synthesizing or critiquing literature like you have in your literature review. Instead, you really kind of need to get into planning mode. So you haven't conducted this study yet, but here's where you need to really think about what you intend to do. So it may feel uncomfortable or weird to kind of plan it out because you haven't done it yet. And you might get stuck on kind of like the what ifs. So, what if I'm not able to recruit 15 people for interviews? Or what if I can't get approval from a particular site? And the best advice I can give is that to kind of just embrace that. So a lot of the what ifs stem from feeling like you're kind of locked into a particular plan because this is the proposal and you want to be able to defend it and get it done. But it's important to know that the plan isn't always going to go accordingly. And that's okay. That's why we have limitation sections in the dissertation. That's why you have areas in the results chapter where you can describe where you deviated from your plan. So I think it's important to just realize this here is just an idea. It's just how you intend to collect the data, but research doesn't always go, in a streamlined, it really rarely actually goes exactly how you intended it to go. So just know that as you're writing this, to kind of break out of that perfectionist mindset and understand that your plan might not completely go as it should. And that's okay, because later on in the chapters, you can describe what the limitations are or what things you stumbled on during data collection. And, it can be explained in later chapters. So I think that's important to consider. And then, if you are really stuck, that's where we come in. So we do provide assistance with all of the chapters in the dissertation. If you are struggling, I recommend reaching out to our team. The email address is in the chat. We do provide a 30-minute complimentary consultation where you can kind of talk about your study, and we can help identify areas where you may need help. And then something else to note is that we do have a variety of different mentors on staff. So we've got research mentors that help with the literature review, the introduction, and the discussion chapters. And then we've also have methods people like myself who help with figuring out how am I going to do this study, and then analyzing and drafting the results section for you. But that is the end of the presentation today. So we can open it up to Q&A. If you have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. And if you don't have questions, that's okay too. I will let you know that you'll all receive a copy of both the slides and the recording of this webinar within 24 to 48 hours. Oh, I see here. Okay, so should the summary be at the end of chapter 3? Yes, after each section, after each chapter, you will have a chapter summary. What if your research doesn't require IRB? Should that be stated? Yes, definitely. You should definitely talk about that, particularly talking about the type of risk that participants face for participating in the study. Typically, it's no more than minimal risk, but depending on your subject matter, if it's something that could trigger like an emotional response in participants, you just want to talk about that as well. Generally, you do have to submit this for some type of approval. So if it isn't IRB, you'll just want to talk about whatever it is for your particular study. But typically there's some sort of institutional review that you'll need. Do we have any other questions? No problem. All right. Well, if we don't have too many questions, I'm just curious if you guys are able to type in the chat. Let me know. Have you started your chapter 3? Are you in the process? Are you stuck? Okay, very quiet group. All right, well, if there are no questions, I am going to go ahead and stop the recording.